Good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got an interesting author to introduce you to tonight. She's actually an author and a poet. And she's got an interesting topic that she's going to talk about today, and that is the subject of a book that she's come out with, which is homelessness. Our guest is Ontario poet Kate Rogers. She is the co-author of a book called Homeless City, and it examines the homelessness and in our community and bears witness to the suffering that so many people are frankly unwilling to observe. She and her co-author, Donna Langevin, are hosting a launch next week in Toronto, with proceeds going to the Daily Food Bank. It's on Monday, January the 8th at Free Times Cafe on College Street. Kate is the co-director of a series of what is this, readings at the Art Bar Poetry Series.
Yes, it's the oldest poetry reading series in Canada, Art Bar.
Excellent. So, Kate, welcome to the show. And tell me, if you could, why would you write a book about homelessness?
I've been very moved and disturbed by witnessing homelessness. I haven't experienced it myself, although I was very poor in university, as many people are. Did not have a lot of support from family, had lots of student loans and so on. And I guess that experience, but also being away for a long time. I was teaching in Asia for 20 years and returned just before the pandemic to Toronto. So those two experiences, sets of experiences, heightened my compassion, I suppose, my feeling of being very sad about the homelessness crisis in all over the country, really, but Metro Toronto especially.
I was told that one of your objectives is to remind people of our privilege and also how we deny humanity to people that are homeless. Explain.
Yeah. I think what can happen is that when people are going about their lives, people who have jobs and a comfortable and safe place to live, encounters with unhoused people who may have mental health issues or addiction issues are just experiences they don't want to acknowledge. And it's too stressful or painful because many people are struggling these days, of course. The cost of living is very high. People are struggling to get food on the table. I mean, the poetry reading, the launch for Homeless City on January 8th will give funds to the Daily Bread Food Bank, as you mentioned. And in fact, 1 in 10 people in Metro Toronto uses a food bank. And so
1 in 10 people uses a food bank.
Yeah, that statistic was released in the last few months by the Daily Bread Food Bank, and it's connected to a network of food banks around the Greater Toronto area. So yeah, it has accelerated the number of people who are using food banks in a very short period. So I think for me to finish answering your question, having lived in a couple of different societies overseas and being away from the place I grew up, coming back and seeing that society is in crisis and unhoused people are in crisis, and many people want these unhoused people to be invisible for one reason or another. It makes them uncomfortable. It's inconvenient to have exchanges with them if they happen to be asking for money or if they have other issues. And so people don't want to acknowledge them. And I think that's part of the problem. Government obviously has to take the lead in supporting unhoused people, but if voters don't want government to do that, then I guess it will be a lot less likely to happen.
And this is, I understand, a chap book, a
Yeah.
CHAP book. What, please tell me, is a chap book?
A chapbook is a small selection of poetry. So this book is 40 pages, and it's by, as you mentioned, my co-author Donna Langevin and myself. And poets tend to put together chapbooks when they have poems on a theme, in this case, homelessness. They have a selection of poems which they hope would eventually end up in a full-length collection of poems. So some of the poems from Homeless City are in my forthcoming poetry collection, The Meaning of Leaving. And it's because my poetry collection, The Meaning of Leaving, deals with violence in society in different ways. So anyway, a chapbook is a selection of poems that will end up eventually in a full-length collection.
The description of this chapbook is interesting. Let me read it if I could. The poems
Sure.
in this book are two women's personal testimony of their frequent encounters with people experiencing homelessness, poverty, mental illness, and addiction. They bear witness to what many of us have unwillingly observed in Toronto and other communities across Canada. The poems challenge and surprise with their honest sharing of the complex feelings many of us experience when facing the unhoused. They move from initial revulsion and fear towards compassion, encouraging us all not to look away from the human suffering on our literal doorsteps. Homelessness, unhoused, cast away. These are us, just without a home. And then the quote from the poet laureate of Toronto is, "I could hardly get through these poems for my tears." Donald Langevin and Kate Rogers show us how poetry can care and can make you care. The beauty of these poems reaches deep into our cluttered and clustered humanity with sage tenderness that calls us to be with and to be appalled at the inhumanity of so many left adrift among us.
Yes.
Very, very powerful.
Yeah, I am very grateful to Lillian Allen, who is Toronto's new poet laureate, for that blurb. And she has written poems about homelessness and witnessing the suffering of unhoused people herself. So that's why we approached her, and we were very glad to get her support. But I do think that many people who, whether wherever they live, I mean, I moved to Coburg recently, and so although I grew up in Toronto and I work part-time in Toronto, I'm I moved here in order to be more comfortable, I suppose, in different ways. And it's a more affordable place. But there are unhoused people here. There are lots in Coburg, and quite a few
Unhoused
of
people
them.
everywhere, regrettably.
Yeah, everywhere. Many small communities. And many of those communities don't feel like they have the resources to support unhoused people.
I was at a fascinating conference recently where one of the speakers said that we have to see this as an economic situation as well as a social, and that too often we only see it as charity and as a social issue. But he said, economically, if we actually house people, it's a lot cheaper than it is to let them stay homeless because homeless people are frequent users of emergency rooms of hospitals and dealing with cold weather, places and other mental health issues and healthcare issues end up costing 2 to 3 times, if not more, than the cost of actually providing housing.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, I mean, it's practical to house unhoused people because maybe they would need fewer of those kinds of reactive supports. I mean, if we were proactive as a society, and maybe another way of doing it to connect it with the idea of homelessness being an economic issue is maybe it would be better for society to have fewer encounters with people who are in distress. I mean, I think it distresses everyone to experience an encounter with somebody who is in crisis. And I mean, if people are already feeling that they can barely get through the month, you know, they're living paycheck to paycheck, or worse, they may be using food banks themselves. And then they see somebody who's unhoused, who may have mental health or addiction issues, possibly acting out on the street. It may be harder for them to feel sympathy. But if our whole society could look at something like a basic income for people living below the poverty line, then we would be agreeing as a society, as a wider community, that this matters, that everyone matters and deserves to have a safe and comfortable place to live, as well as enough to eat.
Could you read us a poem from your book?
Oh, certainly. Yeah.
Why don't we take a break for some messages? And when we come back, we're going to ask Kate Rogers to read us a poem from her book, and maybe one from her book on violence as well, if that's possible, because I think that would be interesting for everyone to get a sense of poetry about a major social problem. Stay with us, everyone. Back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is homelessness, but addressing it, or at least raising awareness of it by way of poetry, which is kind of interesting. Our guest is Kate Rogers. She is a poetry and critical writing expert, and her critical writing and poems have appeared in many literary journals and anthologies, both in Canada and abroad, including the Montreal International Poetry Prize anthology, looking back at Hong Kong, Subterrane, ARC, Prism, and many others. Her most recent poetry collection is Out of Place. She is a co-director of the Art Bar Poetry Reading Series in Toronto, and her upcoming poetry collection, The Meaning of Leaving, will be released in February. But on Monday, January 8th, is the launch of a 40-page chapbook of poetry about homelessness called Homeless City, with co-author Donna Langevin. And it is at the Art Bar Poetry Series at the Free Times Cafe on College Street, 320 College Street. Kate, could you give us a sense of one of your poems by reading it, if you could?
Certainly. I'll just give a little context of this poem.
Excellent.
It's set, it could be set anywhere, really, but it takes place in front of a Tim Hortons. And it describes a regular encounter I had with somebody in my neighborhood. It's called The Nose Ring Girl.
The Nose Ring Girl.
Yes. In front of Tim Hortons, most days, with her supermarket shopping cart, 2 pyrite rings in each nostril. Her age? 17? 19. She stretches out her skinny hand, palm cupped for coins. Her sleeve rides up, a bracelet of scars binding her wrist. I buy her a bran muffin, which she drops at my feet, shouting, "They use lard." That is our second meeting. The cardboard cup of squash soup she knocked from my mitten yesterday like vomit on the sidewalk. It will seem strange to her when I try again tomorrow. Ask her name, as I must. How much of her rage can my pockets hold after I empty them of coins? I watch as she uncrumples foil from a takeaway meal, folds it into a flat silver cone, pinches triangles from the edge, spreads open a shining snowflake, tucks the corners into the steel bars of her cart. Was she evicted by her landlord for non-payment of rent? I picture her sweaters crocheted with holes, jeans torn at the knees, falling from green garbage bags as she dragged them into the savage cold. At 19, I had an attic room in an old row house. No insulation. Major Street, Toronto. I was thin, layered sweaters, tights under trousers in winter, making my rent by lifting spines from fillets of salmon and sole in Kensington Market. Party, common room, Rochdale College. A high school guy held out a silver foil boat with a long line of Coke. Like icing sugar. I dipped my index finger, rubbed some on my gums. My heart leapt me over, couples entwined among boots in the hall. I forgot my coat, sprinted down Yonge to the ferry docks, watched the sun fry its yolk on the dark grill of the lake.
Very powerful in the way you connect your own life story with the homeless girl is interesting.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I think empathy is something which motivates me to write poetry. And I think that's true for many poets. Not everyone chooses to write political poetry or poetry of witness, as I do, but many poets are increasingly doing that when they encounter social issues and they want to express themselves, but they also want to communicate their feelings about what they're witnessing.
How did you get into poetry?
Oh gosh, I think I started writing poetry when I was under 10 years old, but then some English teachers in secondary school really encouraged me. And I studied journalism, and I worked in the field for a while and PR, but I realized that I'm probably too sensitive for those fields. So I went into teaching as a way to earn a living. And poetry was something I wanted to teach because I wanted to support my students' development of their feelings, their values, their ideas. And poetry lends itself to that. And I love language. I love words. So they came together very naturally for me.
And you taught in Asia?
I taught in Toronto as well. I taught at Centennial College, Seneca College, taught literature, taught academic writing. But then I got a great opportunity with Centennial to go and teach in their China program. And I taught mostly academic writing for them. And then I got offered a really good job at the University of Hong Kong, where I taught literature, but I taught advanced ESL, as well as academic writing and many other subjects. And then I moved on to City University in Hong Kong, which was where I spent the longest time. So I was very lucky, and it was a fascinating experience. But for many years, I wanted to come home. So here I am.
Writing seems like the opposite of poetry.
Yes, academic writing is the opposite of poetry. And yet poetry is a way of processing ideas as well as feelings, but perhaps through metaphor and simile and line breaks and all the other literary devices. It's usually a less direct way of communicating.
A less direct. Why do you mean that?
Well, it's not using facts, it's using an interpretation of experience. And it's not saying this is the way it is, it's sharing an impression and one perspective, usually.
A lot of people aren't exposed to poetry today. If one wants to get exposed to poetry, do you have a recommendation on the best way to do so?
I know that Mississauga has a great poetry scene. Recently, the Art Bar had a Dead Poets Night, and a number of our readers were from Mississauga, including Lisa Shen, who is the Youth Poet Laureate of Mississauga, and Paul Edward Costa, who is a former Poet Laureate of Mississauga, came to that event. And as I've mentioned, my co-director for Art Bar, Michelle Hilliard, who's very active in the poetry scene in Mississauga, they were all there. So those are people, and if you look them up they're very active in Mississauga, especially young people, if they want to connect with Lisa Shen, Shen. Mississauga has a very active poetry scene, and you can just go to an open mic event or a more organized event where they're feature readers, which is what Art Bar has. And Art Bar also has open mics. And you can go, and if you feel brave, read on the open mic. And if you want to just listen, you listen. And then maybe it will inspire you to write poetry.
When I was a kid, I loved Henry Drummond. I'm not sure if you know the name, but he was a poet in Quebec that wrote sort of in Franglese, French, in English, but with sort of a French accent. And I loved his imagery of growing up in Quebec and in rural Quebec. Was there a favorite poet that you liked?
Oh gosh, many. I think when I started to become more aware of poetry and I was reading Canadian poets, I was reading people like Lorna Crozier, who is based in Saskatchewan. I was reading, of course, Margaret Atwood, and a lot of women poets for me. That was very important because I felt like my reality was mirrored by the things they chose to write about. So, I mean, Canada has many poets. I don't know the source of this. I was trying to find it the other day, but I have read that Canada has more poets per capita than almost any country in the world. Why? I don't know. Maybe because we have winter, although winter is changing here with climate change, but perhaps that's why we produce so many talented poets and musicians, because of winter.
What is it about poetry that makes it impactful? Is it the rhyme? Is it the cadence? What is it?
Well, I mean, these days, many people write in free verse. Some people who perform spoken word may use some rhyme. But I think it's the ability of the poet to share her, his, or their experience of life and observations. And usually it pivots around a moment. Poetry is condensed. And one of the things Margaret Atwood said about it that's meaningful to me is she described it as condensed emotion. So I think that's what it is about poetry. It gives people a chance to capture moments, the epiphanies they have when they realize something, when they observe something, when they make associations. Poetry is often full of associations, kind of the way our minds work, where one thing riffs off another. And so poetry expresses our inner experience, and it's a way to connect with others. And I think those things are very important these days, because we can feel quite isolated for all sorts of reasons.
I've always been a big follower of politics, and I've liked the politicians that maybe not have used poetry, but have used sort of concepts that I think come from poetry to make their speeches even far more impactful. I think about Jesse Jackson as one example that used rhyme. Barack Obama, who used repetition of, yes, we can. Are there ways that people should be thinking about using poetry or some aspects of poetry in everyday life, or in political rhetoric, or in other ways of life?
Yeah, you're talking about rhetoric, and I've taught rhetoric, and yeah, I mean those techniques, repetition, or possibly rhyme. They're very effective. They're often used by poets. And yeah, so those things originated with poetry and made their way into political discourse, because that's how we persuade people, through language. And I think it would be helpful for people who want to become better communicators, whether verbally or on the page, to read people like Barack Obama or Jesse Jackson or Lillian Allen, Toronto's poet laureate, who does also use repetition and a lot of those devices. And there's another poet who teaches a class in spoken word poetry at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, Andrea Thompson. And she's a spoken word poet who writes for the page. And she uses a lot of the devices that you were just referring to, repetition, and she refers to how music influenced spoken word as well. So I think if you want to be a good communicator, as well as reflect on your inner life and share it with others, it's good to read poetry and also seek out some of the people that you've talked about and who I just mentioned.
I had a creative writing teacher that once told me that even in business writing, but in lots of communication, there was a power of three. And so, you would say, tall, smart, and blonde, or like for some reason using three was far stronger than 1 or 10. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. And I've used that power of three in my own poetry, not all the time, because it is a pattern that's fairly common. Then I would often subvert it, so I would only use 2 or something like that, because it's important to keep it fresh. I mean,
so you can't use 3 all the time.
Yeah, don't use 3 all the time. But I mean, it's good to read people like George Orwell on how language can become hackneyed if it's overused. It's important to try and keep things fresh. So yeah, those are all things people can do if they want to improve their communication.
I find it interesting that you're writing poetry about violence as well, and you've got a book coming out in a month. After the break, could you read us something from your book on violence?
Certainly.
Let's take a break for some messages and back into and listen to Kate Rogers recite something from her book on violence, a poetry about violence. That sounds almost incongruous. We're going to be back in 2. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga Night 60. A really interesting conversation tonight with Kate Rogers, whose poetry and critical writing have appeared in many literal journals and anthologies, both in Canada and abroad. In February, she's coming out with a full-length collection of poetry about society's casual disregard of violence toward the most vulnerable, including women and homeless. Kate is a survivor of domestic violence and is an undeniable voice to raise awareness of this issue. Wow. Kate, tell us why you wanted to write a book of poetry about violence.
I think it came together organically. So I didn't set out to do it, but I was writing a lot of things about the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, where I was based for 20 years. And I had lived through domestic violence in my last marriage. And during the pandemic, that ex-husband died, and his brother got in touch with me, and I felt free to write about what had happened in that marriage after he died, but also a surge of memories almost swamped me. So what did I do? I had to write. But I also want to help survivors of violence. And I want to help people, as I was saying earlier, when I was talking about the book Homeless City, the chapbook Homeless City. I want us to see the things that society may end up making invisible for a variety of reasons, because it's uncomfortable, because it's difficult, because many people are struggling in their day-to-day lives, so they don't have the emotional energy, the psychological willingness to engage with what's happening around them. But I think if we all did that, then we could create more community commitment to making these violent experiences visible and caring enough to prevent them. Not perhaps all the time, but I think if we don't engage with these things on some level, and as I do through poetry, then they can happen in the shadows.
Could you read us something from your book?
Yeah, this is called The Giraffe Bone Knife Set, and I will just preface it by saying it's set in Hong Kong and Africa. The Giraffe Bone Knife Set. None of my knives are clean. I reach to the back of the drawer, prick my index finger on the longest blade in the set of giraffe bone knives, morbid gift from Derek, my ex. I saw the dead giraffe on safari with Derek in Africa. A spotted hyena tore the tendons from its long mottled body in a dry riverbed. Derek, hand tense on the door handle of the Range Rover. A flock of bald vultures burrowed through the splayed ribbed fence of the giraffe. Derek leaned on the horn, opened the door. On hands and knees, he yanked 3 vertebrae from the great neck, dropped them on the floor behind his seat. The smell, flesh, sweet with decay, the lingering, wet dog stink of hyena. He took those bones to a craftsman in Joburg to carve into handles, fit the best carbon steel for agile blades. I waited in the locked car, without keys, on a side street to avoid carjackers. Across the road, a guard, camo cap over his eyes, bore a Kalashnikov rifle, leaned on a wall topped with glass shards. The day I met Derek, I was birdwatching in Hong Kong. I walked into a tunnel, a shortcut. He stood near the mouth, binoculars around his neck, khaki shirt, sweat stained under the arms. He looked even lonelier than me. Our first trip to South Africa, Derek's country, safari in Kruger Park, where animals roamed free. All night, lions crunched bones below our Jeep roof tent. Sunrise, I needed the toilet. Derek locked me out of the Jeep. "You scared an eagle away," he yelled. Back in Hong Kong, he shoved me against the wall. Dinner late, no beer in the fridge. Sucking my bleeding finger, I decide again to keep the blade, to remember. I slide it to the back of the drawer.
Domestic violence is a huge issue in our society. Is it really something that you think poetry can address or raise awareness of?
Absolutely, I do. This poem that I've just finished reading was shortlisted by Rue Magazine, a feminist literary magazine out of Vancouver, in 2019. And several of the other poems in The Meaning of Leaving, my poetry collection, came out in the American journal Writing for Peace. And I think by writing about these experiences, anyone who goes through them, particularly women, um, would have a chance to share their reality, speak their truth, and help other women understand that they're not alone. Because one of the tactics of abusers is to isolate the person they're abusing from family and friends, and gaslight them. So deny their reality. And I think poetry, because it is condensed emotion, is a very effective way for women who have been abused or are being abused to express their experience. It's harder when you're in that kind of relationship. Obviously, it's a lot easier when you've been able to leave. But I hope women who might come across my poetry or hear this interview would feel like their experience had been mirrored, and it might help them feel like, okay, I'm not alone. The things that my partner or possibly my family are denying are actually happening to me, are real, and I can act to express myself and get myself out of this situation. There are lots of community resources, not enough. The last statistic I read was that 4 in 10 women in Canada have experienced domestic abuse. So, as you say, it's an extremely common problem, and it reflects society's problems, that men feel that it's okay to take out their frustration on the women in their lives. And the fact that we don't want to see that there may still be people out there who have the old attitude, a man's home is his castle. So we don't talk about what goes on at home. Those attitudes linger, even though they originated 100 years ago. So I think poetry is a way we can reach out to women who are experiencing abuse, empower them, and shine a light on what is happening, what is so common in our society.
You said a minute or two ago that your partner denied and your family denied that the violence was happening. Seriously? Did your partner deny that he was violent?
Yeah, he did for a long time. He, I think, couldn't see himself in that way. And one of the poems in my book is called The Passing of Sean Connery. And it's about how my partner, Derek, was inspired by Sean Connery. And I don't know how well known this is now, but in the, I think it was in the 1980s or early 90s, Sean Connery, the actor who played James Bond, gave an interview to Playboy magazine in which he said it was okay for a man to hit a woman, but he had to do it differently from the way he would hit another man. So that's the point that, on which my poem, The Passing of Sean Connery, pivots, because my ex-husband, Derek, used to say that to me, and he used to say that women like to be hit.
He used to say that women like to be hit. Seriously?
Yeah. Yes, sure. But there are a lot of men out there who would justify controlling behavior or abuse with those kinds of statements. They try and rationalize their behavior when really they're acting out of insecurity, rage, fear, but can't name those emotions. So they are looking for someone to take those feelings out on. It's very complicated. Each situation is different. I'm not a psychologist, but certainly that was my experience. And I think it's the experience of many women based on what I have read.
What about your family? You said your family denied as well.
Yeah, they did for a time, and it's not something that I talk about with my family. It's a lot of that experience happened when I was overseas, but there were dynamics in my family when I was growing up that probably made me more vulnerable to abuse. There was emotional abuse, and that can kind of set the groundwork for someone being more willing to accept physical abuse. And physical abuse often comes with emotional abuse. So, like I said, it's very complicated, but I do think shining a light on domestic abuse and emotional abuse is one way to prevent it or help women leave those situations where they're experiencing abuse.
Kate, this is just, I apologize, but shocking. How long did you have to deal with this? How long did you put up with it?
6 years. I we were in a long distance marriage after a while because my ex-husband Eric was a civil engineer and I was based in Hong Kong. I was teaching at Hong Kong U and City U. Um, but after a while, because he was based in Taiwan, I went to live there with him. Tried to get pregnant during that time, and that was when the abuse became the worst. So it was the worst during that period, and I left him after that intense period of physical violence in Taiwan.
I'm so sorry you experienced this, but it sounds like you've gotten through it, and it's now become one of your missions to write about it
Mm-hmm.
via poetry and try to impact society.
Yeah, to educate people, but also, I mean, one of the roles poetry can play in society is it can help people hear things that mirror their experiences so that they feel um, somehow, okay, it's okay for me to express this publicly, whether it's through poetry or in some other way, and reach out for help. But poetry, the best poetry, um, has the personal expressing universal experiences. It's true of any writing, really.
If people want to buy one of your books or follow you, what's the best way to do that? Is there a website, or how do they connect with you?
There is a website and it's about to be updated, but it's katerogers.ca. And I can be reached through the website. The two books, The Meaning of Leaving and Homeless City, will go up on that website within the next couple of weeks.
We're going to take a break and come back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've been having an interesting conversation with Ontario poet Kate Rogers. She is the co-author of a book called Homeless City. It's a chapbook that examines homelessness and bears witness to the suffering that so many people, number one, experience, and number two, are also unwilling to observe. And she's got an event where they're going to be launching it and reading from it Monday, January the 8th. But in addition, she's got a book about poems about violence that we've talked about that's coming out in February that she's read from. So homelessness and violence. Have you got, Kate, any uplifting book, any uplifting poems, any, nice ones?
Yes, I do. At the end of Homeless City.
Could you read one of those for us, please?
Certainly, I will. This poem is set in downtown Toronto, and in this poem, I'm on my way to the dentist, and it's about an encounter with a homeless person. But it's perhaps more positive. I hope it reflects our shared humanity. Peregrine. That's the title. Hurrying to the dentist, early morning, groggy, CN Tower in its fog cocoon. Rain darkens the asphalt. The dentist must expose my dying nerve again. My gums will be numbed, pierced. A white shape pulls my gaze upwards. A flying sickle, gull. Peregrine. The bird revolves slow, scanning the park for the plump startle of a pigeon. I imagine its hooked hunger, talons piercing warm flesh. A man in a green tent unzips his silver flap, waves. Look up, I say. He scans the sky and grins, gap-toothed.
It's suggesting that we need to make a connection. We need to see people in our society. We need to see them as human.
Yes, absolutely.
And too often we don't.
That's right. Too often we don't. And I think that's one of the ways that society can become violent, that if there is a general sense of denial, like people don't want to face social inequities, whether they're affecting women who are in abusive relationships and who are isolated by their partners or under supported by society, or whether it's affecting homelessness, people who are unhoused and have related issues. Yeah, absolutely. We need to see them.
Hey, Rogers, this has been very powerful. I really appreciate it. I think that you've raised my consciousness and hopefully our listeners' consciousness about homelessness and about how it impacts them and how it impacts us, and how that we need to see their humanity and how we need to be human in our reactions to them. I raised the economic issues. You raised the social and the humanity issues, and I think all are relevant. And also about violence, particularly domestic violence. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Remind us of the website they should go to if people are interested in reading some of your poetry or buying some of your books.
KateRogers.ca.
KateRogers.ca. Thank you for your poetry. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for listening.
That's our show for tonight. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Hong Kong or downtown Toronto or Coburg at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videocasts are available after the show is on the radio on my website, briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody.